I'm very excited to be here with you today to explore this notion of what is it about student and educator agency that's important for entrepreneurship and enterprise education. So I'm wanting to challenge your thinking here. I'm really not trying to give you anything that's too prescriptive. I don't really want you to be thinking, he said this, therefore, if I think that makes sense, I'll just go off and do that. I'm really hopefully trying to give you some tools today and some different frames from which you can explore your own practice and your own students' needs. I think a really good place to start this is by asking a question. What is good entrepreneurship education? Or perhaps what is good enterprise education? I'll let you either make the distinction there and or put the emphasis on either one as it particularly suits you. So we'll pause for a couple of seconds here, and you can contemplate that. And I want you to write it down so that you can share it with the people that you're sitting nearest to. What do you think is a good entrepreneurship education or good enterprise education? Let's pause here for a minute. Okay. Let me share with you what I've noted in my recent book and elsewhere in other presentations in relation to what do I see as good enterprise education. And I'll explain my preference in terms of enterprise education and entrepreneurship education in a few minutes. For me, good enterprise education emancipates students from a sheltered world and allows them to explore and determine their connections to life. It is born from a field of action that differs from one individual to another. It's a process of filling out latent personalities or of allowing new conceptions of self and environment to be formed. It is a process of educating from within rather than educating from afar. It is a process that fully starts when the student's life and learning are synchronized. Its aim is the development of individuals who demonstrate a capacity for self-negotiated action. So, before we compare and contrast here, I should explain this term at the bottom here, this self-negotiated action. I define self-negotiated action as the agencies individuals demonstrate in directing their conscious thinking and action towards an alignment of their inner and outer worlds in order to succeed in life. And when I'm talking about agency in an education sense here, I think it's useful to sort of see how I'm defining education. And so I'm using Tyler's seminal definition. Education is a process of changing the behavior patterns of people. This is using behavior in the broad sense to include thinking and feeling as well as overt action. So we're not talking about a body of knowledge, and we're not talking about purely experiential learning. We're talking about a really broad, the hands, the minds, and the hearts, the whole thing, bring them all together. So I'm curious to know to what extent my idea of self-negotiated action may or may not allow you to sort of already have a connection to my thinking, or am I doing something in a parallel universe, or am I doing something that's really going against the tide of your own thinking? Let me just, before we go on to this notion of agency, so I think that's an important thing for us to explore, let me just show you an image from my forthcoming book, which might help you to understand my differentiation and focus in terms of EE. So see the outcome of entrepreneurship education, whether it's entrepreneurship education, that's on the bottom, or enterprise education, that's on the top, as being self-negotiated action. And I fully expect that lots of different people will have different views on this. My thinking tends to be driven by, I suppose, a desire to try and find baseline conversations that we can have, foundational conversations. So not the full outcome of what you should be doing, but those initial inputs that should guide whatever it is that you end up doing. Most likely in the room right now you've got Alison and Alan Gibb back in 2010 published some interesting work where they had about 44 different entrepreneurship pedagogies. So given that, and that's not all of them obviously, given that we can find several scores of entrepreneurship pedagogies, there's no much point telling anyone how to do it because we already know that it gets done in a lot of different ways. What I'm trying to do here today is to challenge your thinking in terms of thinking, okay, well, if I'm going to do it the way I want to do it, are there some foundational issues that should be built into my approach? Now, in this diagram, you'll notice at the top, we've got a little person on the little e, big E, and that person gets bigger as they make this journey. And what I'm trying to represent there is this notion of discovering this knowledge of self, their inner world, providing opportunities for adventuring, getting them to accept the presence of luck, good luck, bad luck, and giving them that capability of being able to sort of not necessarily blindly believe that they're superhuman, but to have a greater capacity for action as a result of that process of education. On the bottom, we've got entrepreneurship education, so we've got a big E at the start because it's the entrepreneurship which takes preference over the education, whereas at the top, education of oneself takes preference over entrepreneurship, but in this case, enterprise. It may seem subtle. You could argue another way. You could argue that there's an education track happening at the top in orange, and there's a training process happening down the bottom. And down the bottom, we've got somebody who arrives with their idea. We're helping them to test the level of conviction that they have about their idea. We're getting them to face up to the realities of their outer world, the environment of where this idea would need to find some form of traction. And we're helping them to develop frameworks for perception in relation to how do they take themselves and their ideas. Now, we don't see these two processes as being totally unconnected. You'll see the little ladders that exist between that allow people from enterprise education to integrate and engage with entrepreneurship education and vice versa. But the outcome is still the same. We've got people at the other end who've had some interesting experiences. You'll see in the very bottom right-hand corner, we've got a student that's failed. That's a metaphor for them failing. Hopefully that student gets up. Some that are only really just grasping and hanging on to the side of this. But ultimately, we want them all to be able to sort of develop that self-negotiated action. Capacity to understand how their inner world can be aligned to their outer world so that they can succeed in life. So that hopefully gives you a bit of a sense for where my motivations lie. And when I talk about EE, what I'm talking about both of these processes. I can't say when they apply and when they don't, because I think every educator has a different way of being able to integrate them, and different students will have different needs, which means that their interaction between entrepreneurship education in terms of training will happen at different times and for different degrees relative to students who are more interested or more in need of enterprise education and that deeper process of personal development. So let's move on a little bit here and think about this notion of agency. So I think this is a challenging thing too. Before I offer to you my ideas on agency, I think it'd be really useful if we stopped again and give you an opportunity to write down what do you think is agency. All right, so let's stop for a moment, write that down, a couple of sentences, whatever it may be for you, and then let's compare that across your tables. Let's see what we think agency looks like for you. So I wonder, did you get something along these lines? Because we've got very in a broad sense, we've got human agency. So Bandura identifies this notion of intentionality, forethought, self-reactiveness, self-reflectiveness as 4 properties required to support self-directedness. So this ability for people to have this belief, this capacity to move things forward in their life. At the other the other sort of extreme, in a more narrow sense, we can talk about entrepreneurial agency. And here we would typically associate that term with the individual ability of people to discover and create new value, and or new value creation in institutional contexts. Now, one of the challenges I find here is I think that neither is entrepreneurship education specific. I think that's a big challenge for us. I think that human agency can be too broad, and I think that entrepreneurial agency can be too narrow in terms of what we're going to be focused on in terms of our classrooms. And so my notion of self-negotiated action is something that has been conceived to try and fill this void. It's more developed in terms of its specific context than human agency, but it's less developed in terms of entrepreneurial agency, in terms of that we're not just saying it has to be value creation. It can be something that precedes that. It can be the development of abilities in relation to understanding our levels of conviction, our areas of interest, and understanding our capacity to develop accurate perceptions of our environment. And we can develop those things without having to have gone off and created new value for somebody. All right? So these things can precede the process of value creation and hopefully give rise to this notion of entrepreneurial agency. So there's a little bit of a stepping stone from very broad human agency, self-negotiated action as a sort of engine to drive us towards something more specific of entrepreneurial agency. I'm curious to know what it would be in your world will be the outcome in terms of student agency. What type of agency do you think that your student should be able to what? So let's stop for a minute again and let's write that down. And when you've written it down, again, compare and contrast across the tables, and then let's see what differences we may have had, what similarities we may have had there. What is it that you want your students to be able to do as a result of an educational experience in this space? I'm also interested to know, what do you think that your educators should be able to do? All right? So what type of educator agency do you think should be possible in this space? So let's take a few moments. We'll stop the video again and let's think about what it actually is you think educators should be. You and or the people that you're assisting and supporting in your institutions. So hopefully by now, what we've got is a bit of a sense of the challenge that's in front of us. There's always a journey that sits in front of us. There's this bright sun, this reality that we view on the other side of the complexity that sits in front of us. You think about when you arrive at a city for the first time. You've never been there, right? You know how to drive a car, you know how to get off a train, but there's some degree of complexity because you really don't know what the local rules might be in terms of navigating, in terms of challenges that may exist. But you know that if you can overcome that, there's this other destination on the horizon. And I think that's the challenge that we face with all of our students. How do we get them from where they are to where they need to be? And that may be part of a judgment call we make in terms of where we think our students need to be, or they may have already given us a fair insight into that process by telling us what they're passionate about, what they're interested in, and what they are wanting to achieve within and beyond their educational experience as it currently exists. So let me share some food for thought with you. I'm going to share with you the notion of a signature pedagogy for entrepreneurship education. I'm also going to share with you a process that I've developed called academic process knowledge. I know it's a big word, and I don't expect everyone to be able to just say these things fluidly. I struggle with them at times myself. Nevertheless, we do need to use words, and words that are given specific meaning, and hopefully it'll make sense why these tricky words need to be used. It's a good at this point to sort of think, okay, so what are we talking about? When we talk about academagogy, what is that? We should be all relatively comfortable with pedagogy. And then, of course, we have andragogy, which isn't that unfamiliar for most people. And the word hudagogy is something which is becoming more used in the domain of enterprise education. So let's look at pedagogy. That's the simple one. I argue it's what the educator independently does to support student learning vis-a-vis the educator's learning objectives. So we have an educator who says, well, I'm responsible for teaching subject XYZ. At the end of that subject, I would like my students to have achieved ABC. Therefore, I'm going to put in place this curriculum. I'm going to make judgment calls around the nature of the learning outcomes that are required, the learning activities that would support those, the type of assessment, the timing of the assessment, the roles and responsibilities of the student as a learner in relation to that curriculum. And so we see pedagogical input as being all of the things that the educator is doing independently of those students. If a student didn't turn up, those things would still get done. In comparison, andragogy, now we're thinking, and often we think about this in terms of adult education, but really we can break it down to it's the opportunity for student self-directedness and autonomy vis-a-vis the educator's learning objective. So the educator still has a role in andragogy, and it's now about trying to emancipate the student's role, their participation in this curriculum, by giving them more sense of responsibility and hopefully allowing them to become more self-directed. That's the key word, self-directed. In contrast, hudagogy is the opportunity for the student to determine the focus of their learning and to negotiate learning outcomes and the nature of assessment required to verify agreed learning outcomes. So here, the student may turn up saying, well, I've got a passion for this and I would like to be doing that in a year's time. And now the educator still has a pedagogical role, but now it's being guided and influenced by the student's initial starting point, which isn't something that was known in advance to the educator. And so we have this process at the bottom called academagogy, which essentially just stands for the notion of scholarly leading. So it's the process through which the educator blends all three gojis to the advantage of the student's learning needs. So academagogy doesn't view a progression from pedagogy to andragogy to hudagogy. It says, these three things are in play constantly. In a perfect world, we've got students who are self-directed. But to get to that level of self-directedness that would be really cool for us and for them, the educator has a role to play. They've got their talents that they bring to this equation. But we also want the students to come along with something that they're passionate about. It may not constitute the entire curriculum of the students. It may only be a project within the process of the students' learning. But it's something that they are passionate about. It's something that they see a value in completing. And it's something that can provide that spark for the educator and the student to have to negotiate the nature of who is responsible for what aspects of the learning and who is responsible for the nature of the resources required for that learning. What would be the outcomes that we think would be appropriate for this project, and that will vary from one student to another, and what would be a fair process of assessment that could be used to verify the nature of the learning that has occurred. So this is a process which is becoming quite common in entrepreneurship education, although I must admit, it's most probably open to different interpretations. I'm in the process of writing a paper to try and bring some clarity back to that at the moment, but this is the intention under which hudagogy was introduced to the field in 2014, this particular process that sits in front of you. So now, from having these four key terms, I want to move back onto this notion of a signature pedagogy. So we can think about some basic assumptions. Now, when I say we, these come from the literature. It's not to say that everyone's going to have perfect agreement with them, and they're not leaning towards that end of what are the specific pedagogies that are being used to help people either teach and or learn entrepreneurship. My focus is what might be a foundation we would expect to see common to all of those 40 odd pedagogies that Alison and Alan contemplated all those years ago. So in terms of ontology, what is the nature of our students' experience when first studying entrepreneurship? My contention would be that our students have naive assumptions. They have an unknown future. There's a delayed progression for the vast majority towards being a bona fide entrepreneurship. And by bona fide entrepreneur, I'm talking about somebody who can pay their bills every week as a result of the activities that they're engaged in. All right? So I'm not talking about selling a few cakes. I'm not talking about doing a few little projects. I'm talking about developing a career around something that they have a passion for and receiving sufficient monies that they can actually carry on and do the things in life that are called living a normal life. In terms of the axiology, what are the fundamental values that guide our approach to teaching entrepreneurship? Well, there's a pretty strong agreement across the literature that students tend to learn about, for, and through entrepreneurship. Now, there are some different variations of that. We've got in entrepreneurship and other bits, but I think we tend to all agree that the first three, about, for, and through, are a part of that. And in terms of epistemology, how do students develop knowledge of entrepreneurship? So how do they learn what entrepreneurship is? Well, again, there's pretty strong agreement across the literature that students gain first-hand knowledge using experiential forms of learning and deep reflection that supports transformative outcomes. So it's not a body of knowledge that can be acquired from a textbook. It actually requires students to engage in hands-on types of projects where they have an opportunity to step back and reflect. And as a result of those reflections, they develop new mindsets, they develop new skills, they develop new competencies, and there's a process of transformation, varying degrees of, that can occur in the student body. So these are the main assumptions that I'm sort of putting in front of you. I'm curious to know to what extent anyone in the room doesn't think that that is what they're faced with. So I'll leave it for a moment for you to have a bit of a discussion about not necessarily what you think should be added, because there's always things we could add, but anything you think that should be taken out of those basic assumptions. Because again, we're not trying to build the perfect model here. We're just trying to lay a solid foundation for whatever it is you might do. All right? So I'll leave you with that for a moment. Okay, so having had that discussion, we've got a process here that I've put together of a signature pedagogy. And what this says, in my case, the outcome is I want students who are capable of self-negotiated action. So that's the outcome on the right-hand side. And my starting point is that my students tend to have naive assumptions that need testing and exploration. That they rarely know exactly what their future is going to be. That there'll be a delayed progression from when I meet them to when they're actually bona fide entrepreneurs, and that their needs will vary. I see that there's a capacity for them to all feel, think, and act. That is an inherent capacity that my students arrive in the class with. For using an opportunity to have pedagogical direction and to provide them with andragogical experiences, it's possible to construct a transformational learning process through which their habits of heart, mind, and hands can be transformed in the direction of them developing that agency around this process of self-negotiated action. Now, in this sense here, I haven't actually said what the students are going to do. That's the other layering that's required to develop your specific pedagogy. The signature pedagogy I'm talking about is something that could be, as I'm proposing it, common to us all. That's all, right? It doesn't have to be replicated perfectly, but the philosophy of it, the recognition of the nature of our students, the recognition that it can't be just purely pedagogy, that we've got andragogy and hudagogy mixed in, and that there's a need for this transformational process to occur through the learning in and around their habits of heart, mind and hands, should produce some degree of agency as you've designed it. It doesn't need to be Colin's self-negotiated action. It can be the agency that suits your needs in terms of where you think those students are heading. So there's that. I'm going to leave you with that for the moment to contemplate. I've circulated a paper that discusses this, so you can take that away and you can think about that. The next aspect of this is thinking about, well, what would it take for you as an educator and all the educators you support to be able to develop this capacity for employing such a signature pedagogy in terms of its foundation to your own existing approaches? And so I've argued that we need to go beyond pedagogical content knowledge, which is quite common in science and maths, where the structure of knowledge is very set. It really doesn't change from one year to another, to a process of academigogical process knowledge. So here we're now talking about, well, who are you? What's your self-ed, your identity? Carol's done some fantastic work in her PhD on the identity of educators, and so I think you can tap into those sorts of work that really allows you to think about your identity and your orientation to EE, because we know within that we're going to find people who are a little bit leaning more towards enterprise education, some who lean more towards entrepreneurship education, some who span that space and integrate it quite nicely. But there's a person, you, and your orientation to this field that we need to recognize and understand. Then the next knowledge base is your understanding of transformational learning. So are you familiar with Jack Mesereau? Are you familiar with Patricia Cranton? Are you familiar with Taylor? Are you familiar with these key authors and researchers in this space? Because it's their works that you need to become comfortable with so that you can move from just simply using pedagogy to using that integration of andragogy, hudagogy, and pedagogy. It's the bringing together of all of those approaches through your knowledge of transformational learning theories. So that's the heartbeat of your approach. It sits in the middle of everything else that you need to know something about. It influences, in the top left, your knowledge of entrepreneurship-related theories and concepts. These are the things that we get from economics, from sociology, from management theories, from marketing. There's a whole range of different concepts that people need to know about what does it mean to start a business, to create a venture, whether that's for-profit, not-for-profit, doesn't really matter. But there are a lot of theories that we need to have general understanding of so we can help our students to understand those areas. In the bottom left, we need to have an understanding of student engagement in this space. How and why do students engage more or not with particular pedagogical approaches? In the top right, we need to understand the knowledge of assessing different entrepreneurial outcomes. Clearly, we can't use the one method of assessment if our students have differing needs and they're all going off and doing different projects. So how do you frame your process so that you've got a consistent way of being able to use assessment? And lastly, your knowledge of how to scholarly lead. And this is the overall knowledge that you're developing in terms of your philosophy of education and your ability to understand what it actually means to use academigogy, that process of scholarly leading. So I'm putting that there. Perhaps you see it as provocative, perhaps you see it as being way too much more work than you actually want to be engaged in. That's fine. And I'm going to send you through some more information that will enable you to sort of play with this and get a bit more of a sense of the actual process. And so I'm curious about what that all means for you. So it leads us to the next obvious challenge, and that is that there's not much point of sitting in the room comparing apples with oranges. So while oranges are tropical and thick-peeled, and they came to Europe from India, and we've got apples, different climate, different type of skin, different origin, nevertheless, they both grow on trees, and they both provide fruit juice. So even though sometimes we are comparing two different things, there's something that unites us, okay? We can always find the things that don't unite us, but that just doesn't tend to lead us anywhere productive. So what is it about you that you share with the other people at the table? So I want you to contemplate that in terms of your pedagogical approaches, where they've started, the types of orientation you have, and the challenges you would have in employing APK. What is it that we have in common? So I'd like you to take a moment to think about that at the table, and then I'll introduce you to another tool that can help you to move a little bit further. So 2 or 3 years ago, I was introduced to this idea of activity theory. I think it's a really, really important framework. I think every educator in our space should be really familiar with activity theory. Activity theory is as simple as this image that's on the screen. It just simply says that any activity in the world, the workshop you're in right now, the cooking you might be doing tonight, your method of transport, learning in a classroom, it doesn't matter. Any activity at all can be broken into 6 components. Every activity has some form of rules, whether they're informal or formal. There are individuals and groups who are involved in this activity. There are tools that are used to facilitate the activity. There are outcomes associated with the activity. There are roles that people play in the activity. And there are community or institutional structures or a culture of relationships that exist in and around this process. So when we're thinking about, well, how would I develop my agency, or why aren't the outcomes that I might like to achieve possible in my institution, then we can find the contradictions that exist between these 6 things. We can find contradictions that exist within, so we've got individuals and groups, and we've got contradictions that exist there. We've got rules that stop other rules from being developed. We've got certain tools which preclude the use of other tools, right? We've got different types of outcomes, right? We've got different types of roles that entrepreneurship educators might be required to play relative to the other people that they work alongside. So activity theory provides you with a really neat way of being able to look at the apples that are in front of you, and even the oranges, and to start asking questions about the activity system within which you're trying to apply your trade. And it's a good way of also being able to explain the sort of the broader context within which entrepreneurship education happens to your colleagues and to your students, so that they actually understand why something's not possible. There's always something that's not possible in what we're trying to do. And so rather than saying, well, it's against the rules, we can explain the different levels of rules that occur and where that sort of roadblock might exist. So look, in summary, what I've tried to do with you today is that the process is to show you that the process of developing student and educator agency, they are very, very linked. You really can't do one without the other. As educators, our learning environments differ greatly, just as our students' needs do. So we want scholars in our field to develop scholarship of their thinking in this field, but there's not much point trying to convince everybody else that what you're doing is right, because we need to appreciate and respect that everyone else has got a different context that they're working in. And so the challenge is, how do we have a common language? I think activity theory provides us with a lens through which we can have a common language, because we only need to talk about the roles, the rules, the tools, the individuals, the outcomes, and the culture. And everything else is just what brings those to life. The challenge is learning how to master the game. Who are the players? What are the rules? How to play the game? And how to score the game. That's a big challenge for us all. So, my plug is that I have a brand new book coming out called How to Teach Entrepreneurship. You've got a chapter of it that I've sent through that accompanies this talk, and that'll give you a bit of an insight into the way things are dealt with in the book. And I hope that might get you started in terms of your thinking in this space. If you're interested in this notion of signature pedagogies, andragogical process knowledge, and even activity theory, they're all covered in the book, not in a prescriptive sense, but in a way of asking questions. And hopefully that will be able to support your development. If you have any queries, questions, I'm certainly not hard to find. By all means, I'm just simply Tasdevil Cole on either Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. And you can obviously email me with any questions that you might have. I'm always happy to have such conversations. All the best, and I hope today's session's been of value to you.